But to start out with, we often talk about validation, verification, hygiene, and I know I'm not the only person who it took a little bit of learning to understand the differences between them because there are, in fact, differences. So I would love if you guys could make sure that we have our definitions in order as far as validation, verification, and hygiene.
Yeah, thanks, Lizzie. So, when we talk about additional revenue in your database, one of the most important things is the quality of the data in there. And as Lizzie mentioned, I'm sure many of you are familiar with an email validation service. And TowerData has been offering that for a very long time. The market's changed a lot since we started offering it in around 2002. And different words have come in, or different kind of practices or approaches to using this service. So as Lizzie mentioned, validation, verification, and hygiene, kind of the three words you hear thrown around. And as the market's matured, so have those services. And I think the definitions have come to a point where, as an industry, we can maybe align with respect to what those mean. So to go first with validation, which is what TowerData calls our service, that encompasses a lot of different things, but more specifically, or strictly speaking, validation. When we talk about that, we're talking about three main things. So the syntax of the email address, right? So is there an @ sign and a top-level domain? Are there any weird characters or spaces? And we're complying with the RFCs that are published with respect to email there. So the syntax of the email, does that look good? And then secondarily, the domain. So does the domain exist? Does it have a mail server? And then finally, the mailbox check. So validation would be really a technical look at that email address. Is it deliverable? In using SMTP tools to attempt to determine whether it is or isn't. So with that, we also have verification and hygiene. And Matt, you want to take us through those?
Sure, thanks, Brian. And verification would be typically our second step in the process. As Brian mentioned, SMTP would be kind of the first pass we take on an email, but when we do an SMTP transaction with the mail server, we don't always get a conclusive response, or that conclusive response isn't necessarily set in stone, and there's other steps that we would want to take to ensure the kind of final status of the email. And the second step we would take would fall under that verification umbrella. So during this process, we are going to look at historical data from emails being sent to that email address. We're going to be looking at transactional data tied to that email address. We're going to be looking at email open data, bounce data, and other activity data around that email to better quantify if the response the server gave us is indeed correct. One thing Brian alluded to is having, been in this business for, 20 years now, since '02, we have a really trove of historical data, which I think gives us such a unique advantage in the space in terms of how servers communicate and how we interpret the response over the years. And a lot of that data falls into our second step, which is the verification process, which helps, us as a provider bring our customers, a little bit more concrete and granular results on that email address. And after that verification process is complete, we'll take that through our third step, which we would define as our hygiene process. And hygiene is a term that I think is a little bit more universally accepted as kind of a non-SMTP check across the industry. And we would define hygiene as most other providers would. I think there's some consensus in the space around hygiene in terms of, is that email a potential spam trap? Is it a known complainer? Is it tied to a spam litigator? Or just in general, does it pose a higher risk to mail to? So, we've compiled this data over the course of 2 decades through dozens of different partners in the data space and the email space that really gives our customers a complete solution. So when email goes through all these 3 steps, we're pretty confident in terms of what the final resolution is on that email. So it's not just a single process or 2 processes. It's really kind of a waterfall process. We take that email through to get a very defined final result.